All right. So, should the government or the central bank be able to see basically all goods and services that you buy, right? And where we're really going with this is with central bank digital currencies. And more specifically today, I want to look at the pros and cons of having a more private kind of transaction policy for these things. So before we talked about like identity privacy, but now where you're kind of looking at your individual identity, and that's what we're talking about. But for here, we want to talk about the individual transactions themselves, right? So what you're actually buying, how much you're spending, when, that sort of thing, right, is what we're talking about for transaction privacy, right? And so to basically define transaction privacy, according to a paper published by the White House's Office of Science and Technology, transaction privacy concerns which entities are able to access which characteristics of transactions, including data privacy. Examples of that would be your account balance, the location of the participants, so your counterparty and you, and also like information about the goods that you're buying, or also the program privacy, right? And examples of this would be like the source code and inputs used for like smart contract transactions, right? If you want to go kind of that route. So that being said, or that's done, I guess. Also, a more private transaction policy could limit the access to sensitive data for legal reasons only, right? So basically we're going the whole like anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism compliance, right? That route when we're talking about this. So maybe by having a more private transaction policy for such a CBDC, like right, a central bank digital currency, basically only maybe we'll say select entities or intermediaries could have access to it. Maybe they're the ones who actually facilitate the transactions, or they're the ones who are holding the, we'll say, account balances, right? They're the intermediaries, right? Which may or may not be the central bank, depending on how it's defined or how the system itself is designed. And I've gone into this in more in depth in past videos, so kind of leave those as reference for this, or at least talking a bit more about those nuances per se, right? But anyways, basically by having this, having your transaction data only be available for legal reasons, what they're talking about is basically like, you know, if something goes wrong and then some entity, whether it be the government itself or maybe an intermediary, whatever the case may be, trying to stay more generalized, right? They have to basically, I don't know, what's the word for it? The equivalent of getting like a warrant, right? The same concept. I don't know if that's I don't think that's what they would actually have to do, because, you know, that's more of like what police and law enforcement does. But I'm using more of the concept. They have to basically more or less apply to be able to get that data, right? And that's kind of where we're going with this. So what are some of the pros and cons of this in general? So this could increase the amount of protection for sensitive data, right? Your transaction data itself, right? The actual attributes of the transaction, right? And so that could be better protected. And this limits the amount of info accessible of the transacting parties to themselves and maybe third parties who are facilitating that transaction, right? And so what this could do is possibly increase the amount of public trust in the system itself, and therefore increase user adoption, which is a big thing for CBDCs, right? Because if no one's using it, you're talking about having a separate system as opposed to, we'll say, kind of the traditional financial system. So like they have to incentivize people to use the CBDC rather than their commercial bank deposits, right? So why would you switch from your bank to a CBDC, right? And that's excluding the fact if they force people to, right? That's kind of a separate topic. Talked about it a little bit before, but that's not the purpose of this video, so I'm trying not to go down a rabbit hole. Anyways, another pro of having more transaction privacy would be a lot of the sensitive identity info may not even be saved in the first place. So if it's not being stored or saved or recorded or whatever, to begin with, it's kind of hard to get that back, or at least significantly more difficult. I'm not an expert in like, we'll say cybersecurity or software stuff, so There may be other ways to get to it that I'm just completely ignorant of. Again, that's not my area of expertise. It's just kind of the CBDCs in general, kind of more of just an interest at this point. But anyways, to continue on, looking at more of the negative consequences of having a more private transaction policy for a potential US CBDC, right? And so basically it could be harder to enforce the AML and CFT compliance, right? The anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism compliance. Because, again, if that data is not recorded in the first place, then they can't grab it, right? And also if they have to go through kind of legal hurdles in order to get it to begin with, it makes it more difficult to receive the information if necessary, right? As they deem necessary, we'll say specifically, right? Again, talking about the government, so take it for what you will, right? One point to make is some ZKP, which is zero knowledge proofs, which you talked about a bit more, and I'll actually put a card, and because I always forget, I'll note the timestamp to put the ZKP video on there in case you don't know what it is or want to hear it more in depth and that sort of thing. I'll put that as a card in the top right so you guys can reference it. Okay, some of those based methods to transaction privacy could actually help limit how much info could be saved for future discoverability. And so that's kind of just more of along the lines of it not even being recorded like I've talked about before, but more of, we'll say, a more technical base. Instead of just not doing it, there's a specific reason because we're using zero knowledge proofs. And again, all of this could be placed in access tiering and that sort of thing, all stuff I've talked about before. You can find more information about that stuff specifically in the playlist that all these videos are in. So it's just US CBDC design choices, right? Trying to keep everything together so it's easy for easy reference, right? Okay. Kind of a final, we'll say, negative consequence of this is it places limitations on data preservation or access could be problematic for existing record-keeping obligations of relevant financial institutions, which is somewhat related to the whole compliance for AML and CFT and those regulations, but kind of looking at it from a different way, just other relevant kind of financial recording requirements, right, that they already have to do, whether it be like or specific filings that intermediaries may have to do, whether they be payment service providers or banks or whatever the case may be, right? So whatever other like publications that are reporting things that they have to do, it might get in the way of that, right? And so one thing to note, or at least one question that arose for me as I was kind of looking through this section, so to say, is how are we going, or how are they, we'll say, going to decide exactly what information needs to be recorded to begin with? And this is obviously kind of related to, you know, what transaction attributes should be saved to begin with, right? Whether that be for AML and CFT compliance or just for it to function in general. And how do, say, zero knowledge proofs go into that? All questions that kind of need to be answered in order for the system itself to function, right? And also, should the CBDC even be able to track what goods or services are being purchased, or only like the amounts and the counterparties? Like if you're going to, I'm from the South, so for full disclosure, if you're going to like and buying, we'll say, $1,000 worth of stuff at Bass Pro Shop, which may or may not happen on a regular basis. But if you're going to do that, should they be able to just see, hey, they spent $1,100 or whatever at Bass Pro, or they bought this stuff, and actually get kind of like a receipt almost of what exactly you bought, right? And to go that far, I guess it's kind of the difference between what already happened with like what you see in your bank account, because when you go into your bank account, I don't know if other banks are different, but you basically just see like the counterparty and the amount, and then the amount you spent, and then how it, in the grand scheme of the ledger of your bank account, right? Your side of the ledger at least. Or is it going to be like, hey, they spent, you know, $650 something on a new gun or ammo or whatever it happens to be, right? Just kind of questions that should be answered, right? And so with that being said, I'm going to wrap up for a more private transaction kind of policy for a CBDC. If there's anything you guys think I missed, or any comments or whatever, or questions, put them in the comments below. Just kind of trying to think this stuff through a bit more and try to gain a deeper understanding of it, and kind of just gain a more holistic view of what the potential for such a US CBDC system could be. And not even just US CBDC. That's just kind of the specific context from which the paper that I found, right, is for a US based CBDC. There's other countries doing this as well, a significant amount of other countries, and I've talked about that before. I have to find the website at some point that shows, it's kind of a map of the world and shows like what each ones are doing, what each countries are doing with respect to a CBDC, and just kind of like different stages and that kind of. It was really interesting to look at. I'll have to find it and put it somewhere for you guys, probably in the description if I can find it. It's been a minute, but anyways, with that being said, more specifically on transaction privacy, I put cards in the top right and the bottom right for basically the alternatives for this, by having a more observable transaction privacy policy, and then also kind of layering it as well to where there's different tiers in the actual privacy itself with respect to transactions. Right, with that being said, I'm going to leave it there, and I hope to see you guys in one of those.